All right, so now we are ready to get started. I want to introduce to you our speaker, Thomas Vellacott. Thomas is CEO of WWF Switzerland, and he has a very interesting background, coming also from the finances, but being very passionate about nature. And without further ado, and to allow enough time for his presentation, which is a central part, I would like to stop sharing now and invite you, Thomas, to start sharing. And in the meantime, we are gonna ask you the next poll question, kind of to also know what's your opinion on this topic. Does the current pandemic slow down or accelerate the shift to a more sustainable world economy? So we have the majority of you already participated. Thank you very much. So we have 28% think it slowed down, 33% thinks it accelerated, and 39% thinks, well, they don't really know. We're very curious to know what's your stand on this, Thomas. And with that last, I give you the word.
Thank you very much, Adriana, and thank you to international volunteers for, well, first of all, for the invitation for me to speak to you tonight, but more generally for the amazing work you do. I'm always humbled when I read about the work being done by the international volunteers. It's truly terrific. Thank you for everyone who's supporting our mission with your time. It's really, really appreciated. I'm afraid you can't see me while I present. This is because I'm presenting from an iPad, and that doesn't seem to be able to master displaying a video feed as well as a presentation. So I shall, as soon as I stop sharing, I'll be back on video. So apologies for that. So you expect me to answer, to tell you who's correct regarding the pandemic and whether it's slowed or accelerated the shift to a more sustainable world economy. Well, the diplomatic answer is you're probably all right. It has slowed us down in some respects. You can imagine it's very hard, for example, for eco guards to go out and patrol protected areas. It's very difficult for our WWF colleagues to go out and work with communities, which is such an essential part of our job. So it has indeed slowed down certain parts of conservation work, and it tells. In several countries, poaching numbers have gone up during COVID because there's simply less staff out there patrolling and less law enforcement going on. So, you know, yes, it has slowed things down in one way. In many other ways, it's actually accelerated things, and I'll show you some of those examples in my presentation. And finally, those of you who answered, we don't know, well, yes, I would probably put myself in that camp as well, because while we see acceleration happening in many fields, it's frankly too soon to say whether, you know, that's the overwhelming thing that's happening. What I'd like to do in this presentation is just show a few share a few observations with you, give you a few data points about what is changing and what we're observing, and, you know, up to you to draw your conclusions of where you think this is going. But I thought that might be interesting. So what you see on this picture that I have as the title page of the presentation is, of course, these are parked aeroplanes in the desert in, I believe it's in the southwest of the United States. And of course, one immediate effect of COVID was the absolute collapse in air traffic. Some of that has gone back up again, particularly domestic travel in places like China, to a lesser extent in the US. But it's nowhere near the levels it was beforehand. So I think that's just one very immediate effect that we quite literally can observe because there's less planes in the sky. But what I'd like to do is really talk about three things. Talk about briefly how do we at WWF think about the ecological crisis we currently face, and then share some of these observations about what sort of responses to this crisis are we seeing and how are those changing through COVID, and then share a few takeaways, possible takeaways, so what, from our observations. So let's jump straight in. And at WWF, we look at, excuse me, we look at sort of two developments, if you will, as the bottom line of what's happening in nature. There's obviously a lot more you need to look at, but one of those two is climate change and what's happening in terms of CO2 levels in the atmosphere. And this is just one such way of looking at it, the CO2 in the atmosphere over the last about 2,000 years. And you see it's always gone up and down. It's never been fully steady. It has sort of oscillated, but it's always stayed within a very narrow band. And that completely changed with industrialization. And you see this hockey stick at the end going up, up, and up. And I'm afraid there isn't an indication that that is sort of changing, that we could point to. And we could go a lot further back. You know, we have ice core data, for example, for the last 800,000 years. And it's again, it oscillates a little bit, but it doesn't really go above 350 parts per million. So the place we're at the moment is just quite literally a place we haven't been in the last couple of 100,000 years as a planet. Now, I can't point to, you know, the exact results of this, but what we can say is this is a very risky place we are, because humanity developed in a very stable climate, and the place we are at the moment unfortunately doesn't guarantee that stability going forward. And the higher we get, the greater that uncertainty and the greater those risks are. So that's climate change as one of those sort of indicators we follow very closely. The second one is something called the Living Planet Index, which is part of a report we publish together with the Zoological Society of London every 2 years. And it's just a way of aggregating species numbers and trends in species numbers around the world. It looks at about 20,000 populations of about 4,000 vertebrate species around the globe. And what you see is that on average, these populations have declined by about 2/3 since 1970. Now, species have always, and population numbers have always, again, changed. They've gone up and down, species have gone extinct, new species have emerged. But the speed at which this is happening, again, is absolutely unique in the history of our planet in terms of what we can see. It's probably something like 100 to 1,000 times above the rate of species extinction that we would historically expect. So again, a very dramatic development in a very, very short time. And now that's the nature side of things, if you will, but Adriana said in her introduction, you know, can we really distinguish between nature and humans? Because we are part of nature at the end of the day, and anything that negatively affects nature will negatively affect us. And I think that's something that people have become really aware of in the pandemic, and even before that, with the growing number of zoonotic diseases, for example, where you see that number going up quite dramatically in the last couple of decades. And one of the reasons, of course, being that we're encroaching more and more on the habitats of these species, and thereby making it more likely that viruses will jump the species barrier between wild animals, domesticated animals, and humans. So all these developments really represent an unprecedented ecological crisis that we face today, and a crisis which threatens both humans and nature. And I'm not sort of trying to bash you with negative news here or anything, but I think that's the background against which we need to see the changes which we're observing today. And we should never forget this, the severity and the urgency of this ecological crisis. So let me move to the second part, which is then looking at responses. How is humanity responding to these ecological crises? And something, again, that's where then the question comes in, and how does COVID influence that? And this was a cartoon that was voted to be the cartoon of the year in Switzerland last year. Not surprisingly, dealing with COVID, but I thought it was a good way of, it sort of shows how the pandemic in many ways dominated our life in this past year, in terms of our freedom of movement, but also in terms of our mind space, in terms of what gets reported on the news. So against this background, it's very easy to expect that, well, the nature and nature protection is probably going on a back burner during this year, because just COVID has been dominating everything, and we'll have economic consequences of COVID to deal with for years. So many people expected, well, that means this whole climate crisis and all this shenanigan is going to be off the public radar, and it's going to be all about economics, all about health going forward. Now, the interesting thing is, a year after the first, or more than a year after the first lockdown, what we're actually seeing is the opposite, that in many fields, questions of sustainability, questions of ecology, have actually gained ground on where they were 12 months ago. And maybe one quote to just give you a bit of a sense for this is Larry Fink, the CEO and chairman of BlackRock, the largest asset manager worldwide, who said, "I believe that the pandemic has presented such an existential crisis, such a stark reminder of our fragility, that it has driven us to confront the global threat of climate change more forcefully, and to consider how, like the pandemic, it will alter our lives. No issue ranks higher than climate change on our clients' lists of priorities." Now, there's one thing if WWF says that, it's something else if the CEO and chairman of BlackRock says that. So that's something which, no one would have said even 2 years ago. This is really quite recent. And what you see, I think what's behind this is that we're seeing in many fields that COVID, like major disruptions before, what it does is it doesn't radically change everything from where it was before, but we don't go back to how things were before either. But what we're seeing is that important pre-existing trends are being accelerated by this pandemic. So let's look at some of those pre-existing trends and where they've been going in the last 12 months. Well, the foundation, if you will, of talking about ecology and protecting nature is really looking at the awareness of the ecological crisis and how that's been developing. So has that been on people's minds? Because that, if you will, is the first step to then take action to addressing these challenges. This is a part of a report that the World Economic Forum publishes each year, their Global Risk Perception Survey. What it is they ask their members, so these are leaders from large multinational companies for a large part of it. They ask them, what are the largest risks, the top global risks by likelihood and by impact? And they've been doing that for about 10 years now. And just look at, starting at the bottom, 2012 to 2021 at the top, and just look at the colors for a moment. And what you see is, so blue is economic risks, green is environmental risks, orange is geopolitical, red is societal, and purple is technological risks. And what you see 10 years ago, there were hardly any environmental risks on the radar of business leaders in the world. If you now look at last year and this year, it's overwhelmingly green. So there's been a real awakening of awareness in terms of the risks that our current economic system poses for the world and the world economy. And that really changes a lot, because then you don't have to explain why climate change or biodiversity loss is so important, but you can build on an understanding which is already there. Or here's another survey. This was among about 1,000 experts working on sustainability, and they were asked what the largest, the most urgent sustainability challenges were. And you see climate change and biodiversity right at the top. And what the other thing you see here is the blue bar is the 2019 figure. The red is how it's changed in 2020. So you see the perception of these challenges has actually been going up, not down. So that's a really important foundation. And I think that's not just among experts and business leaders that we're seeing this, but we're seeing this among the general public as well. And I think what people are realizing more and more is that nature isn't something that's out there that you kind of have to be nice to because it's the good thing to do. But I think we've been really waking up to the fact that people and nature are one, are intertwined. And if we start destroying nature, we destroy the foundation of our own survival and of the survival of our children and future generations. So that changes a lot in terms of perception and in terms of readiness for action. Now, let's look at a few areas and what's changed in the last couple of months. And I'll start with politics with just 2 quick slides. One is, it's just a beautiful picture. This was Joe Biden's first day on the job when he signed an executive order that the US was going to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord. So that was a hugely important step that he did that on his first day. And we've been seeing that climate change is just a completely different standing now than it did under the last administration or even the administration before that. But it's not just the US. I'll give you this chart. What this shows, and forget about the colors, but it shows you how much of the global emissions, CO2 emissions, are covered by net zero pledges, by targets to reduce emissions to zero by around 2050. And in January 2020, about 1/3 of global emissions were covered by such net zero targets. By the end of the year, it was over 50%. And this chart is actually already out of date, because if we did it now, we would be above 70%. So just to show you how quickly this commitment to decarbonization by the middle of the century has really progressed now in the last 1 or 2 years. But let's not be sort of too starry-eyed. There's also negatives on the political side, particularly that, there's been a lot of talk about green recovery. The plans that governments have been putting forward are actually very, very insufficient when it comes to a green recovery and building back better. There's still a lot of subsidy in there for fossil fuels and the like. So there's a lot of work still to be done there. But still, there's a huge change going on in terms of the political landscape we're observing. And let's now look at a number of sectors of the economy to see what's happening there. And these are just really quick snippets because I can't go into much depth in the time we have. But we'll start with energy, because energy is so essential, both in terms of its effect on the world climate, but also in terms of biodiversity. And what you see there is the very surprising for many people statement that today, 2/3 of the global population live in countries where wind or solar power is the lowest cost source of power. And again, this has happened very, very quickly. If you went back about 6 years, that figure would be 0. So everywhere in the world back in 2015, fossil fuels were the cheapest way of generating energy. Well, fast forward 6 years and 2/3 of the population, it's wind or solar that's the cheapest form of producing new energy. Fast forward to 2025 and it's expected to be 90%. And this changes everything, because all of a sudden you don't have to subsidize renewables. You just need to make sure that fossil fuels aren't subsidized, because the market is doing a lot in terms of the build out of renewable energies. And we're seeing huge growth in this area. Last year, the growth rate for renewables actually jumped by 45% in 1 year. So it's huge what's happening here. And you can, one way of looking at it is comparing how much of the global electricity generation comes from coal versus renewables. And you see for a very long time that sort of hovered around the 40% mark for coal and the 1 or 2% mark for renewables. And it's really only sort of started changing in a meaningful way in the last 5 or 6 years. And again, you see 2020, and this is only the first half of 2020, renewables going above 10% and coal down to 33%. So that's a very fast rate of change on a global scale that we're seeing there. But again, before we're getting sort of carried away too much, you see on the right here where we need to be in 2030. We need to have coal down at 6%, and renewables at 28% in order to be on track for a maximum of 1.5 degrees warming. So we have a lot to do in this decade still ahead of us. Now, this can seem daunting, and it can seem like, well, that's completely impossible. It is impossible if you just do a straight line to the future and you know, we're not on track. But it's worth considering that adoption of technology doesn't happen in a linear fashion. It happens in sort of S shapes, where something takes quite a long time to sort of get started. But then once you get the economics going and it starts becoming economically interesting, it can actually change very, very fast, and adoption can be incredibly fast. These are just a number of technologies. And we're seeing this kind of adoption also now in things like renewables or storage. So that was energy, hugely important sector. Let's switch to mobility, and I'll specifically talk about cars. Mobility is a lot more than cars, but let's just stick with cars for a moment. And 5 years ago, Mary Barra, the CEO of General Motors, famously said, "I believe the auto industry will change more in the next 5 to 10 years than it has in the last 50. Now, that's a very bold statement to make. But if you look at the numbers, and now we're 5 years on, it's actually already true. And it's true in several ways. One way is, if you look at global sales of auto cars, they actually peaked in 2017. And since then, they've declined. And again, you see here the very strong decline in 2020 due to COVID. But you see that it's just accelerated a decline which was already there before the pandemic. And the second thing that has been happening, so in a market that has been shrinking, you've had massive growth for electric vehicles. So that's put a real squeeze on internal combustion engines, on traditional cars, because you've had sinking numbers of cars sold, but more and more electric vehicles being sold as part of that shrinking number. And maybe a third trend in mobility that we hear slightly less about, but I think is as important, is you get cities completely rethinking how they operate. And Paris is a good example for this, where you have a mayor who was actually re-elected last year, who is just completely redesigning the city and rethinking the city in terms of making it greener, making it more pedestrianized. You know, cars are still allowed, but they are given much less space than they were in the past. And it's becoming a much more livable city as a result. And this is just one example. You could look at examples the world over where you're seeing more and more of this sort of challenging this current way of thinking of, you know, the car is first and everything else comes second. So exciting developments there. Let's turn to food as a third sector. And there are quite a few headlines and data during the pandemic showing that meat consumption has actually been going down. Again, that wasn't a new trend. In many countries, it was already sinking before the pandemic. But we saw an increasing shift to alternative protein sources during the pandemic. And if you look into the future, there were some interesting studies that came out in the last year or so. This is one by the consulting company Kearney. They looked at the development of the global meat market, meat in sort of quotation marks, because they looked at meat coming from slaughtered animals, but also vegan meat replacement and cultured meat, so meat out of produced in labs. And whereas today conventional meat makes up almost the entire global market, by 2025 they expect vegan meat replacements to make up about 10%. You see by 2030 you get cultured meat coming in and together making up about a third. And fast forward to 2040 and you only have 40% of the market coming from conventional meat. Now, this is a radical change in a relatively short time. And, you know, the global meat industry has not woken up to what's going on here. And again, this is being driven to a large extent by changing consumer tastes, but also by economics, where this is the alternatives are simply becoming much better in terms of taste, but also much cheaper than they have in the past. So this is a very, very radical shift with important consequences for biodiversity and for the climate. And a final sector to just quickly look at is finance, where again, in the last 12 to 18 months, we've seen some quite dramatic announcements being made. One of them is, for example, that Lloyd's of London, the world's largest insurance market, has announced that they quit fossil fuel insurance by 2030. Now they should be quitting before 2030. Let's be clear about that. But this was nowhere on their horizon a few years ago. So this has happened quite quickly. Or to give you an example from Switzerland, this shows you the development of sustainable investments in Switzerland, and you see a huge growth there in the growth rate there in the last 2 or 3 years. And you actually now have about a third of assets under management in Switzerland having some form of sustainability criteria applied. I should caution this is self-declaration by the banks. So this is not what WWF will classify as sustainable investments, all of this. But it is a very relevant development because it shows that this is no longer a niche topic, but this is really becoming very mainstream. So that's just a few of these sectors which I wanted to point to. Some of the changes in politics, some of the changes in energy, in the way we move about, in the way we feed ourselves, and in the way the financial system works. So what does all this mean? To sort of try and summarize this a bit, what does this mean? Well, 3 things I'd like to leave you with. One is, again, going back to the beginning of my talk, you know, climate change and biodiversity loss make up an unprecedented and worsening ecological crisis, which threatens both humans and nature. This is not yet getting better. Let's not pretend it is. You know, this is a very, very urgent crisis we're facing here. And people are becoming increasingly aware of the crisis and the consequences of the crisis. And what we're seeing is now a very substantial shift in key sectors of the world economy that are facing disruptive change on the way to becoming more sustainable. And really a speed of change which we haven't seen since the Industrial Revolution. And the momentum is accelerating, which is exciting. But again, let's not pretend we're on the track we need to be on. We are still far from it. We need to accelerate these trends even further in order to successfully address the ecological crisis. And that's a very confusing sort of conclusion. A lot of people struggle with this, that we have a worsening crisis and a rapid transition at the same time. People often ask me, well, you know, what is prevailing? What, you know, will we make it or will we not make it? And I think it's important to understand this isn't an anomaly. This is what you very often see when you see when we've gone through periods of disruptive change as humanity. You've seen this very negative crisis and you've seen rapid change at the same time. for me, it's not a question of will we make it or not. It's a question of this crisis makes for such an urgent need for action. And at the same time, this transition we're seeing makes for such a huge opportunity to really accelerate further. So this is a very, very unique moment in time that we face here. And the next 10 years are going to be absolutely crucial in whether we can accelerate this positive change further. So please consider this an invitation to be part of this change and to shape this absolutely crucial decade as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. It's a very interesting presentation. Now we will turn to some Q&A. So if we are still recorded, but if any of you wants to turn the camera on to make it maybe a little bit more interactive, feel free to do so. We already received some questions. So the first one I got from Thomas is the following. The new video clip from SVP, the Swiss right-wing party, shows a dystopian Switzerland in 9 years from now. People are cold, can't change their iPad, can't afford to travel anymore, all because they voted left and green. What do you tell someone who is actually worried about such a future? And why should they not fear radical changes that we need to undertake? It's a long question.
What I would say is look at the evidence. Look at the evidence in terms of what the costs of inaction would be and compare it with the cost of action. And you'll see that, in fact, it is a lot preferential to act fast because the costs of inaction are much, much higher. And the fact that, you know, the forces opposing change, the forces that want to keep us in a fossil fuel age as long as possible, the fact that they need to resort to that kind of fear-mongering just shows them how serious this transition is and how scared they are from this about this transition. So I really see, you know, that there's the old saying of it's sometimes attributed to Gandhi. It wasn't actually Gandhi who said it, about first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. We're in the fighting stage. They're no longer ignoring us because this is too important.
Very good, thank you. We have a couple of questions regarding more to the investment part that you mentioned, especially the slide on BlackRock. One question from Jack is, BlackRock had a good quote about the importance of climate change, but are they actually changing the investing process?
That's a good question. I would say the jury's out. They've been saying some very good stuff. They have actually started to exercise their voting rights in a couple of cases to support, for example, resolutions for greater transparency on CO2 emissions of companies. So there is some evidence that they're shifting, but I think it's way, way too early to say, you know, how far that goes. You know, they're being watched, they know that, and I think they're taking it much more serious than they did even 2 or 3 years ago.
Thank you. Another question from Simone is, does WWF have any support in how to invest in sustainable investment forms, or which sources could you recommend?
So we do a rating of retail banks in Switzerland. We did it once, and we're actually about 2 weeks out, we'll be presenting a second rating where we look at their offering and we say where they stand. So that will give you some indication, but we don't do that on the level of the individual product. It's a rating of banks rather than of the institution rather than the individual product. So there are you know, ratings out there that look at individual products, but I think the most important thing is that ask your banker if they tell them you would like to invest in line with the Paris Climate Accord, and then see what they do. See if they can come up with an answer. Some banks have products. but most banks have no clue how to ensure that their investments are in line with the Paris Climate Accord. And by asking those kind of questions, you can actually show that there's a market for this. But we're seeing a lot of change. Banks are realizing that they are running some really big risks that they don't even measure at the moment. So there's quite some, I wouldn't say panic, but there's a bit of worry around that they're missing the boat.
Yeah, very interesting. A similar question, a little bit in the same area. What are the biggest levers in Switzerland for private persons like us, like everybody, in order to make an impact?
Okay, there's a quick answer to that and the long answer. A quick and a medium answer. The quick answer is calculate your ecological footprint. If you Google WWF ecological footprint, you'll get to a footprint calculator we publish that will actually analyze your specific footprint, because it's different depending on where you live, how you live, etc. So I can really recommend that, and we can share the link with you otherwise as well. The sort of slightly longer answer is there are 4 or 5 levers that in most cases cover the biggest parts of your ecological footprint. And I'll just quickly reel through those. So, and it closely links to the sectors which I showed you before. So one is how you heat your house if you own property, or else you have slightly less influence there, but you can of course talk to your landlord. So how you heat your house is a really big piece, fossil fuel or not. A second one is how you move about. That's, do you use cars? If so, what kind of car? Do you use more public transport? How often do you fly? That was the one which really got me when I first calculated that. So that's mobility. The third one is what you eat. And that is a lot about how much meat you eat and how much dairy products you eat. A fourth one is how you invest your savings. And all of us have more savings than we think through our pension funds. And that's another really good lever you have there. In many companies, there are employee representatives sitting on the board of your pension fund. And if you write to them and say, hey, I really care about having sustainable investments, that makes a difference. And the final point is if you live in a country where you're entitled to vote, or you vote in your home country, that's another really important lever, that you vote for politicians who don't just say they care about the climate, but actually show they care about the climate. And we do a rating of Swiss politicians, for example. In many other countries, you have that as well. And apologies, I just saw in the chat, yes, that link is not in English. I'm really sorry about that. We haven't done it in English. There's one on the website of WWF UK, which is in English. It's, you'll have to translate from British terminology to some extent, but that will give you some idea if the Swiss one doesn't work for you.
Also, there is the option in the Google to translate the whole page. That would
Google Translate. Google will take care of that. Wonderful.
Exactly.
We have one question from Bérangère. What is your position regarding the green growth some businesses try to sell us? With the planetary boundaries, limitation on raw material, cost of externalities, and polluters pay principles, or the carbon taxes, should businesses keep growing, or should they only try to thrive?
It depends. I think we've become addicted to a growth model which is very dangerous and which clearly doesn't work, because we just pretend that we live on an infinite planet, which we don't. But it depends in the sense that you need to actually go and look at what is the company selling and how, it's the growth in the use of natural resources that is the problem, not per se the growth if it's decoupled from from resource use. So if you take double the number of yoga classes a week than you currently do, that's actually not a very problematic growth, because it will not lead to massively more carbon emissions. If you decide to double the number of flights you do a year, then that's a pretty big footprint. So that's why I sort of resist the urge to have a yes, no, growth is good or bad answer. It's just a bit more complex, and it's worth looking at the ecological footprint.
Thank you. Maybe one more question from Thomas. The companies like EasyJet and Holcim both now greenwash their products, the flights, the cement, buying CO2 certificates. Do you think the general people will feel an incentive to change their behavior with such offsetting mechanism?
No, offsetting has a huge number of problems. One is that a lot of the offsets being bought are purely hot air. There's no actual reduction behind it. That has to do with the methodologies being applied. But even good offsets, and there are, or carbon credits, I will say, even if you buy high quality carbon credits, gold standard carbon credits, if you do that and just sort of continue as you did before, then it's a pretty pointless exercise, because it will not get you to net zero. So what we do with companies, for example, is we say, first of all, you set yourself a reduction target, which is in line with the Paris Climate Accord. It means you need to get to net zero at the very latest by 2050, actually probably in a developed country by about 2040. And then you need interim goals of how you get there. Once you've done that, you need a portfolio of initiatives that actually make you reduce your CO2 emissions, so it doesn't just stay a nice statement. And then you can start investing in carbon finance as an additional measure, but it's not instead of what you do, instead of aggressively cutting your emissions, it's in addition to that. And anyone who just offsets is frankly just pretending that we don't have a problem, and that the longer you pretend, the harder it is to adapt. So I would very, very much caution against that.
Maybe we have time to take one more questions, and that would be the following. Are there specific points that we can discuss in regard to the CO2 Act to counteract the SVP arguments?
Sorry, how you can argue? How
can you counteract their arguments?
Yeah. So look, I think there's two things, and just to be very clear, the vote we have coming up here in Switzerland on the 13th of June, or there are actually 3 votes on environmental issues, 2 on pesticides and 1 on CO2. They're all really, really important. And we are going flat out at the moment in working to get a positive result there, because it's very, very hard. And that has to do with the costs. Our opponents have been very smart in the campaign they run in just talking about costs, and it's unfair, especially for the poor people out there. Completely nonsensical arguments when you look at the numbers, because it's the 10% of the population would actually pay more when it comes to the flight tax. 90% will be better off under the law. So there is complete bogus numbers being passed around. So I think one thing we have to do is just challenge people on the nonsense they're putting out there, because it really is nonsense. And then the second thing we need to do, and I'm afraid that hasn't happened enough in the campaign so far, is we need to be very clear. This is not just about money. On the money front, it's actually way cheaper to act now than to act later. So even on the money front, you need to be for this law. But it's about a lot more than money. This is about what sort of responsibility do we have to future generations, and do we live up to this responsibility or do we not? And we need to call out the people arguing against the law, because they've done something very smart. Up to about 3 years ago, the SVP party argued that climate change wasn't happening. They realized that doesn't cut it anymore. You can't argue that way. So they changed their argument. Now it's happening. But Switzerland's such a small country, so it doesn't matter what we do. And we're much better than all the other countries anyway, so why should we act? And if we have to act, then we better do it through innovation rather than through law. We need to call them out. These are the same politicians who 5 years ago voted against the Paris Climate Accord. And now they come and pretend that they are for climate change. They're not arguing for climate change. They are arguing for keeping us hostages to the fossil fuel industries for as long as possible. And we need to make that argument very, very forceful. They are arguing against this law because they're being paid by the Oil Association of Switzerland. This is a moral argument, not just a financial argument. Sorry, I get worked up about this.
No, thank you very much. Very, very interesting. Let me start sharing the presentation again. Should be able to see it right now. So I wanted to thank you. Oops. Thanks a lot, Thomas, for the presentation. That was very interesting, very inspiring and insightful. I'm sure everybody learned a lot today, a lot of new facts. I love the quote that nature and people are actually intertwined. It's always good to remind people of that. I was personally impressed to realize again how many sectors are actually impacted by climate change and biodiversity loss. And your presentation was like a wake-up call or reminder to everybody that actually everybody is impacted by the ecological crisis and we all have to act, every one of us. So thank you for the presentation. Very, very interesting.
Thank you for having me. It was great being here. Thank you.
Sure. To everybody joining today, it would be very greatly appreciated if you could fill in a short survey, giving us your feedback on the talk today and on the presentation. We will put the link in the chat, or you have the QR code here. It's a very short survey, roughly 3 minutes, and it's anonymous. And it really helps us to improve our future events. So thank you in advance. Feel free to open the link already now if you want to have it to fill it in shortly after the presentation. Many thanks to all the organizers who helped to organize this event today. Pia, Adriana, Melanie, and Han, they're all part of the board of the International Volunteers for WWF Switzerland. Thanks a lot for helping with the organization. I wanted to make you quickly aware of the project Volunteer that we're having right now. So we as international volunteers are also very much involved and acting for the vote, so in favor of the vote on June 13th. And we are starting a couple of initiatives. So if you have time and feel like joining us and helping us with this initiative, feel free to register in the link that we also will post on the chat, on the one you see on the right side. The time is where we need some help is until it's just started right now and will be until June 12th. So feel free to contact us with this link. That would be really great. Also, don't forget to check out and follow us on our social media. We are present on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. On YouTube, you'll be able to find the recording of the talk from today. And we also have really great initiative and campaign ongoing right now, focusing on the CO2 social media campaign, for instance, the Meatless Mondays. So feel free to check all our channels and like our posts. That would be much appreciated. And last but not least, the upcoming events. Last but not least, exactly, we have 2 upcoming events. We have a cleanup day around Switzerland on Saturday, May 29th. And so it's happening in Zug and in Zurich. And we have a next webinar planned in June on the Pledge for Nature. You can find more information on the meetup, on our meetup page, where you probably registered today to participate to the call. And very last information that I would like to give is actually WWF is very much supporting, as you could understand, the vote on the June 13th for the yes, for the yeah. And even if you can vote, please vote. And if you cannot vote, it doesn't mean you cannot have any impact. You can actually talk to your friends, your family, colleagues or neighbor, and for that to support in favor of the yeah and explain why it's important to vote. And for that, there are actually postcards that have been created in 3 languages, in German, French, and Italian, that you can order online. They are free, and there are materials simply to help promote the vote on June 13th. So we also post the link on the chat. You can feel free to check it out, order them, and then as said, you can either deliver them directly to friend or family, or you can actually post them. They're already pre-stamped. So very cool action that you can check out. So that's it for tonight. I would like to thank you, everybody, for participating today. Thank you for your very interesting questions. Thank you, Thomas, for a very warm thank you also for your time. And if there's nothing else, I wish everybody a lovely evening. And thank you, everybody, again for joining. Hope to see you very soon to our next events. Bye-bye.